Space was never truly silent. Not if you were listening the right way. It whispered through the hum of ship engines, crackled through radio waves, and groaned in the shifting hulls of dying wrecks, drifting through the void. But this ship, this thing, was different. It didn't whisper. It didn't hum. It didn't groan. It absorbed sound. A black ghost, moving through the stars without a trace. No one knew where it had come from. No one had ever seen it arrive, and no one ever saw it leave. It simply appeared, always at night, always in deep space, a shadow against the black, darker than darkness itself. Some said it wasn't a ship at all, but something else entirely, something that had no right to exist among men. But people had tried to board it. Oh, they had tried. The last recorded attempt came from a military reconnaissance team, a squad of hardened men and women, trained to survive in the harshest environments. They had faced the horrors of deep space. They had seen war, death, and things that shouldn't have been possible. But none of that had prepared them for this. Their mission had been simple: investigate the Black Ghost spaceship. Find out what it is. Report back. But the last transmission they sent was barely a whisper, a broken voice crackling through interference. We're not alone. They don't make a sound. And then silence. For 3 weeks, no one dared approach the ship. It just floated there, waiting, as if it knew, as if it was listening. And then, like it had never existed, it was gone. No trails, no debris. Just an empty void where it had been. And now, years later, it was back. The signal had come in from a small outpost near the asteroid belt. A mining vessel had picked up an anomaly, a perfect sphere of darkness, blotting out the stars. No movement, no life signs, no response to hails. But the readings were wrong. They made no sense. The ship's structure didn't match any known design. It was there, but it wasn't. Like a shadow that refused to fade. A crew was sent to investigate. Not military this time, a civilian salvage team. Less firepower, more curiosity. People who had seen wrecks before, who had picked apart the dead for a living. They weren't scared of ghosts. But ghosts don't always need fear. Sometimes, they just need you to get close enough. The docking procedure was smooth. Too smooth. The ship didn't resist, didn't react. It was almost welcoming. The airlock opened without a fight, revealing a corridor stretching into pure darkness. No flickering emergency lights. No broken panels sparking in protest. Just cold, empty silence. The crew hesitated. The ship felt wrong. Not abandoned, but waiting. Like it had been sitting in the dark for something to arrive. For them, the leader signaled for the lights. The beams cut through the black, revealing metal walls that weren't metal. They had the texture of bone. Not smooth like steel, not rough like rusted iron. Something organic, something alive. It felt as if the ship had been grown, not built. They pushed forward, deeper into the corridors. Their footsteps echoed back at them, but only slightly. The walls seemed to drink the sound, muting everything, making the air feel heavier with each step. The deeper they went, the more the ship felt like a tomb. Then they found the first body. A man, frozen mid-step, still standing, his face locked in silent horror. His suit was intact. No damage. No wounds. But his helmet was cracked from the inside. His face, twisted and pale, looked like he had been screaming in absolute terror. Someone whispered a curse. The sound barely carried. The ship had a crew once. And if the rumors were true, they were still here. Somewhere. Moving forward, they entered what should have been the control center. The room was empty. No chairs, no monitors, just a vast circular space, surrounded by walls that pulsed faintly, like breathing skin. The air smelled wrong. Stale, but not like decay. Like something had been waiting here for too long. Then the lights flickered, just for a second, and when they came back on, the entrance was gone. A wall now stood where the doorway had been. Smooth, seamless, as if it had always been there. The crew spun, weapons raised, breathing sharp and ragged. The ship had closed its mouth, and in the silence that followed, they finally heard it. A single, faint footstep, not from one of them, from behind. They turned, slowly, lights trembling in their hands. And there, in the farthest corner of the room, something stood, not moving, not breathing, not blinking, just watching. And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was something heavier, thicker. A void that pressed against their skin, settling into their bones. The flashlights flickered, struggling, as if the ship itself was fighting to keep them blind. Someone breathed too loud. A sharp inhale, a curse under their breath. The sound barely carried. It was like the walls ate noise, making it impossible to tell how big the room really was. Then the static started. Soft at first, like the distant crackling of an old radio buried under layers of interference. It came from their earpieces, but none of them was speaking. The crew leader's voice came in low, steady, forcing control. Everyone check in. One by one, voices came back, whispering names like prayers. Everyone was here. No one had moved. No one had breathed too hard. But something else had. The static grew louder, rising and falling like it was tuning itself. The ship didn't just absorb sound, it was listening. One of them cursed under their breath again. Screw this. We need to get out. Find the door, find any way out. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping the room. Nothing. Just the curved walls, pulsing faintly, like something alive just beneath the surface. And then, the beam landed on the corner, the place where something had been standing. Nothing was there now, but the dust was disturbed. A faint, human-shaped outline, like someone had been standing there for a long time. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, a noise. Not static. Not the hum of failing tech. A whisper. Close. Right next to them. No words. Just a breath. They moved fast. Stumbling, flashlights cutting wildly through the air, sweeping the walls, searching for a seam, a handle, something, anything that looked like a way out. Someone reached the wall where the door had been, ran their hands over it, desperate, fingers searching for an edge. There was nothing, just the same smooth, unbroken surface. Cold and dry, but too smooth like glass that had never been touched before. Another noise. Not behind them this time. Above. The beam shot upward, hitting the ceiling. The breath caught in their throats. The ceiling was wrong. It wasn't a ceiling anymore. The smooth surface had shifted, pulled back like the peeling of skin, revealing something behind it. Shapes. Shadows, barely visible, pressed against the thin, membranous layer. Not moving. Not breathing. Lined up in perfect silent rows. Human shapes. Dozens. Maybe more. Suspended in the walls, in the ceiling, in the ship itself. Not corpses. Not alive. Just waiting. And one of them had opened its eyes. Pure white. No pupils. No irises. Just an empty, glowing stare. The static screamed through their earpieces, cutting into their skulls. Someone dropped their flashlight. It hit the ground, rolling, the beam spinning wildly, catching glimpses of faces pushed against the walls. One of them had a helmet. Cracked from the inside. The frozen man from the corridor. He hadn't been standing. He had been left behind. The truth hit all of them at once. This ship had a crew, and it never let them leave. Something shifted in the dark. A whisper of movement, just enough to tell them they weren't alone. Not anymore. Someone, maybe all of them, started running. The problem was, there was nowhere to go. Their boots slammed against the floor, the sound strangely muffled, as if the ship itself was swallowing it. Flashlights bounced wildly, beams cutting through the thick, suffocating dark. There was no sense of direction, just blind, desperate movement. The walls pulsed around them, the soft, fleshy texture shifting under their fingers whenever they brushed against it. It felt wrong, like the inside of something alive. Someone ahead skidded to a stop, nearly crashing into the others. Dead end. Their voice was tight with panic, their breathing ragged. The corridor just ended. Smooth, seamless, like it had never been meant to lead anywhere. A flashlight flickered, then died. Another followed. The darkness grew heavier, pressing, watching, waiting. Then came the sound. Soft, rhythmic, like something tapping against metal. At first, it was distant, but it grew closer. Not hurried, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, patient approach. Someone fumbled with their gear, trying to force their backup light on. It clicked, flickered, then failed again. We need to move, find another way. The crew leader's voice was barely steady now. But where? Someone hissed back. There's nowhere to go. Tap, tap, tap. Closer now. Then a whisper. Not through the comms. Not from any of them. Right next to them. You shouldn't have come. The air turned ice cold. A breath ghosted over the back of someone's neck. They spun, swinging their flashlight wildly. Nothing was there. Then something moved. Not in front of them. Behind their eyes. A memory that wasn't theirs. A ship, just like this one, but different. A different crew. Different faces. Their suits were newer, their weapons untouched. They had come here too. Stepped into the dark. And then, screaming. The memory shattered, leaving behind a single, overwhelming feeling. No one leaves. Someone stumbled backward, clutching their head, breathing too fast. What the hell was that? They barely got the words out before something shifted again. The corridor they had come from was gone. The ship had changed. Twisting, bending, closing off paths and creating new ones, herding them. Someone grabbed the leader's arm. We need a plan now. The leader swallowed hard, forcing down the rising panic. We keep moving. There has to be a way out. There was a way out before, another crew member muttered. Now there isn't. The tapping sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then, the walls breathed. A slow, shuddering inhale. The air turned thick and heavy, like something massive had just woken up. A low vibration rumbled through the ship. Not mechanical, not the hum of failing power. Something deeper, older, alive. Then, in the farthest stretch of darkness, something stepped forward. A figure, humanoid, silent, no footsteps, no sound. Its face was wrong. Not a helmet, not a mask, just blank. Smooth, as if it had been wiped clean. The crew froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Then it tilted its head. Not like a person. Like something trying to remember how people move. Someone whispered, "That's not." The figure vanished. A heartbeat later, it was closer. No movement. No blur. Just there. Right in front of them. The air turned to ice. And then the lights went out again. Darkness swallowed them again. Not just the absence of light, but something deeper, heavier, a presence pressing in from all sides. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, making every breath feel like it might be their last. Then movement. Not footsteps. Something shifting. The kind of sound you hear when a door creaks open in a house that should be empty. The kind of sound that means you are not alone. A flashlight flickered back to life. The beam cut through the dark, shaking as the crew member's hand trembled. The others huddled close, scanning the space around them. The figure was gone, but something else had changed. The walls weren't the same. They had moved again. The corridor they had been in was wider now. The breathing texture of the walls had smoothed out, turning glossy, reflective. But the reflections weren't right. They didn't match the crew's movements. Some didn't move at all. One of them turned their head, and their reflection stayed frozen, its face staring straight ahead. Someone cursed. Another gripped their weapon tighter. What the hell is this place? No one had an answer. Then, from deep within the ship, something clicked. A sound like a lock turning. Then, another. And another. A chain reaction, something activating. The air grew colder. The lights in their suits dimmed. The ship was doing something, and they were in the middle of it. The crew leader's voice came through, tight and urgent. "We have to move. We can't stay here." "Move where?" Someone shot back. "There's no way out." "There's always a way out," the leader said, but even they didn't sound convinced. Then, the reflections moved on their own. A whisper of motion, just enough to notice. One by one, they turned their heads toward the crew, but the real crew hadn't moved at all. Then the reflections smiled. Not a human smile. Too wide. Too sharp. And then, they stepped forward. Out of the walls. A hand grabbed someone's shoulder. A real hand. Cold, too strong, fingers digging into the suit. The crew members screamed. The others turned, flashlights catching a glimpse of something wrong. It looked like them, but it wasn't. The face was off. The posture was off. The eyes were too empty. The leader reacted first, pulling their teammate back, shoving the thing away. It didn't stumble. It just tilted its head, watching. Then the others started stepping free. The reflections were no longer reflections. They were here. And they all looked exactly like the crew. The first gunshot shattered the silence. A desperate, instinctive move. The bullet hit one of the things in the chest, and for a second, it didn't react. Then slowly, its head turned toward the shooter. And it smiled again. The wound in its chest closed. That was when the panic truly set in. The crew ran, but there was nowhere left to run. "You said, pick up from where the last part ended and write introducing a second plot twist or escalating the main conflict. This section should raise the stakes, surprise the audience, and drive the story toward its climax. Keep building suspense without resolving the main plot, and maintain SEO with relevant keywords. Ensure the narrative flows seamlessly from the previous sections. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also, make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also, don't create violated content, which can affect YouTube policy." Chowchted said, "Chouch." They ran. It didn't matter where. There was no plan, no strategy, just pure, desperate survival. The ship shifted around them, the corridors stretching, twisting, closing behind them. The walls pulsed like a living thing, breathing in sync with their racing hearts. The air was thick, heavy, like running through water, like the ship itself was trying to slow them down. The sound of footsteps, too many footsteps, chased them. Not echoing, not distant. Right behind them. The copies moved silently, perfectly, unnaturally. Their movements weren't frantic like real people fleeing for their lives. They weren't running to escape. They were running to catch them. One of the crew stumbled. A rough hand grabbed their arm, too cold, too strong. A second later, someone else yanked them free, dragging them forward. No one looked back. They didn't need to. They could feel them there. Then the ship spoke. Not in words. Not in a voice. In memory. It wasn't just flashes now. It was all around them. The air rippled. The walls flickered. And suddenly, They weren't in the corridor anymore. They were on the bridge. But not their bridge. Not their time. A different crew stood at the controls, frozen mid-motion. Their uniforms were clean, untouched by time. Their faces were turned toward the front screen, where space stretched out before them, endless, black, calm. Then the alarms went off. The frozen figures moved. Not like ghosts, not like echoes, they were reliving it. One of them shouted something. Their hands flew over the controls. Another ran toward a screen, pointing at something they couldn't see. Their voices overlapped, panicked, human. And then they saw it. A shadow. Not in space. In the ship. The crew in the memory turned too late. The lights died. The figures collapsed, one by one, their bodies vanishing before they even hit the ground. And then, just as suddenly, the memory was gone. The crew was back in their own time, alone. But not really. Because now, they knew. This had happened before. Many times. And no one ever made it out. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Charged, like a storm was about to break inside the ship. The crew stood frozen, their breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The echoes of the past still clung to the walls, fading like smoke. But the truth was clear now. They weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. A sound broke through the silence. Not footsteps this time. A heartbeat. Slow. Deep. Not theirs. The ship was alive. And it had been watching. Waiting. One of the crew members cursed under their breath, backing away toward the nearest console. We have to do something. We can't just wait here and let it happen. Their fingers hovered over the controls, but the screens were dead. No power. No systems. Just a cold, unresponsive surface. Then the walls shuddered. Not metal. Not structure. Flesh. The realization hit all at once. This wasn't a ship. At least, not in the way they had thought. The smooth corridors, the shifting walls, the way it absorbed sound, it wasn't failing. It wasn't broken. It was feeding. The past crews. The ones who had come before. The ones who never left. They weren't just taken. They were consumed. And the ship had learned from them. The reflections weren't just copies. They were what was left. A shiver ran through the group. No one spoke. No one had to. They were next. The tapping sound returned. Not behind them. Inside their heads. A slow, steady rhythm. Not chasing. Calling. One of them stiffened, eyes going blank, body twitching like a puppet on invisible strings. The others barely had time to react before their teammate took a step forward. Not stumbling. Not uncertain. Controlled. Stop. Someone reached for them, but the moment they touched their arm, a shock ripped through them. A force so strong it sent them staggering back. Their teammate turned and smiled. Not their smile. The ship's. The crew moved fast. They had no choice. It was leaving them two options: run or become part of it. One of them reached for their emergency pack, fumbling for the one thing they knew still worked: the detonator. The ship wanted them to stay. It wanted them to become something else. But if they couldn't escape, they weren't going to let it win. They set the charge. A small device, barely the size of a palm. Just enough to tear through whatever this thing really was. The reflections stepped closer. The walls pulsed, reacting, sensing what was coming. A breath. A heartbeat. Then detonation. A soundless explosion ripped through the space around them. The walls cracked open, not like metal breaking, like flesh tearing. And then the screaming started. Not from the crew, from the ship. The ground heaved, the corridors twisted, the dark pushed against itself. The figures, the echoes, the things that had been waiting, they shuddered, flickered, then collapsed into nothing. The crew ran, forcing their way through the crumbling structure as the ship came apart around them. A doorway. A real one this time. Not a trick. Not a shifting wall. An actual way out. They didn't look back. Not until they were clear. Not until they saw the ship from the outside. And that's when they realized the final, terrible truth. It wasn't a ship at all. Not in the way they had thought. It was a graveyard. A body made of bodies. A thing that had been drifting through space for centuries, maybe longer. Consuming, changing, becoming. And now they had hurt it. They had escaped. But as they floated away, watching it shrink into the endless dark, something inside it shifted, not dying, healing, waiting. And as the last of the ship disappeared from sight, a final whisper crackled through their comms. You shouldn't have left. The crew sat in silence. The ship that had once seemed like a marvel of technology, an advanced vessel designed for exploration, was now nothing more than a floating corpse in the vast emptiness of space. Even as it disappeared from their view, a lingering sense of dread hung in the air. They couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. They had just become part of the ship's story. Did we just blow up a corpse? The voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it echoed in the tight quarters of their escape pod. No one answered. They all knew. It wasn't just the ship they'd destroyed, it was everything. They had torn at the fabric of something ancient, something alive in a way they hadn't been able to comprehend. A life form maybe, or an intelligence so alien it defied understanding. The reflection creatures had been more than just copies of them. They had been manifestations, shadows of the ship's hunger. The crew hadn't been chosen to die, they had been tested. They were part of a long line of experiments, part of an ancient ritual of survival that the ship had perfected over centuries. Every living thing that came aboard added another piece to the ship's infinite existence. And now, there they were, alone, floating in the silence of space, with nothing but the black void around them. The escape pod's thrusters hummed faintly as they coasted toward the nearest station, a place where they would find refuge, safety, and answers to what exactly the ship had been, and why it had turned on them. But in their hearts, they knew that the truth was something far darker. They couldn't erase the sense that the ship's final message had meant something more than just a threat. You shouldn't have left. One by one, the crew started talking. The adrenaline of escape was starting to fade, and with it, the memories of their close call began to crystallize into something more concrete. The ship had wanted them, but it wasn't just a ship. It had been waiting, like a trap. An ancient predator that had learned over centuries how to lure in its prey. The reflections, the distortions in the walls, the voices in their heads, they had all been part of the game. And now they were free. But there was a price. They had witnessed something alive. And whatever it was, it hadn't been destroyed. It was still out there. A crew member, who had been staring blankly out of the small viewport, finally spoke up. Do you think it'll come after us? The question was simple, but carried the weight of everything they had just gone through. They all turned their attention to the view outside, as if the vast emptiness of space could give them an answer. But the void only stared back, indifferent. I don't know, came the response, slow and measured. But what I do know is we can't let it happen again. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. No one wanted to speak the truth aloud. They all felt it. The realization that they hadn't just been lucky to escape. They had been part of a cycle, a repetition. The ship had changed them, absorbed them, fed on them. And now, they were part of something greater, something cosmic, something they couldn't understand. The fear was there, gnawing at the edges of their minds. But it was also curiosity, a curiosity that stretched into the deepest corners of space. The escape pod's computer blinked to life, a steady chime echoing through the cabin. A small, unfamiliar signal appeared on the screen. A distress signal. It was weak, garbled, but it was there. A message: we are coming. You can't outrun us. The voice was low, distorted, like static, but the crew could feel the words in their bones. They had already seen what was capable of the entity inside the ship. It was still alive, still coming for them. A slow realization began to settle over them. This wasn't a one-time event. This wasn't an isolated encounter. The ship was just one of countless others in the endless reaches of space, each one carrying its dark secret, each one with its own hunger. The crew had already made their decision, even before the final message came through. They weren't going to just run and hide. They couldn't. Not anymore. "We need to go back," the leader finally said. There was no hesitation in their voice, just a grim certainty. Not to the station. Back to the ship. The others didn't question it. They couldn't. They knew what had to be done. They had felt it, the ship's pulse, its presence. It wasn't over. It was never going to be over unless they stopped it. But as they turned the pod back toward the dark, distant shape of the ship, a final thought crossed their minds, something too terrifying to ignore. What if they were already too late? The void stretched endlessly in front of them, the blackness of space seeming to close in around them as they powered the pod toward the wreckage. A strange sensation hung in the air, the feeling of being watched. They weren't alone. Out there, in the deep, something stirred. The crew braced themselves, unsure of what they would find, but determined to face it head-on. But the true terror would come when they realized that this time, they were the ones being hunted. The ship had learned from their escape. It had adapted. And now, the game had changed. As the crew watched in horror, a dark, fluid shape, something alive and shifting, crawled over the remnants of the destroyed ship, its surface undulating and pulsing with a horrible intelligence. It was waiting for them. And there was no place to run, because it was no longer just the ship that had learned. They had learned too. In the end, the crew would have to make one final choice: to become part of the void or become the hunters themselves. But the ship was already deciding for them. As the pod closed in, the walls of the destroyed vessel began to rearrange, slowly, purposefully, almost as if they were waiting for the crew to arrive. The pulse quickened, and a new reflection appeared, a new version of the crew, one that wasn't alive. And the chase began again,